we've just celebrated the first 100 days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was first announced more than 3 months ago. Nothing happens and nothing will happen. Russia has no plans of attacking Ukraine. We have no reason to do that. There is no military infrastructure to do that. Whatever we hear about the Russian plans is something we hear from the US administration, from the Western media. And so for us, it's very hard to react to all this rhetoric, which is just a continuation of endless fakes about Russia's intentions. Ukraine is a friendly nation to us. Many Russians have relatives and friends there. Both my grandmothers are Ukrainian. So, we are not going to attack our friendly nation, period.
Well, you say there's no military infrastructure to do that, and yet we are witnessing, are we not, the biggest military build-up since the end of the Cold War. 100 battle groups in place, 14 more on the way. Reports of 60 attack and transport helicopters arriving in Crimea. The deployment, as you know, of many naval vessels in the Black Sea, including amphibious assault vessels. We've got combat enablers there, including huge amounts of fuel we've seen arriving, enormous military hospitals arriving, bridge assets too. How can you possibly stand there and say that there is no military infrastructure when Ukraine is surrounded on three sides?
The pictures you are showing now are pictures of standard military installations which are many hundred miles away from the Ukrainian border. If there are any movements of the Russian forces, these are the movements related to military exercises, which we are doing on our own soil. Actually, I was listening to Mr. Stoltenberg, and I was amazed by many things, but mostly by two things. First, he said that Russia should de-escalate on its own territory, which to me sounds amazing. Two, he is saying that NATO is increasing its military potential in Eastern Europe. But according to Russia NATO Founding Act, which he actually also referred to, NATO is not supposed to have any nukes and no troops and no military infrastructure on the new member states. And that's actually the point of Russian peace proposals. We actually asked NATO to get back to NATO Russia Founding Act of 1997, where the rules of the game were well established. They didn't do it. And they just rejected this proposal as something unthinkable. They rejected as something unthinkable the possibility for non-expansion of NATO, which was promised to the Soviet Union back in 1990, 1991 by every single Western leader who was visiting Moscow or with whom Russian leaders, Soviet leaders were talking outside of the country. I worked in the Kremlin then. I met Douglas Hurd. I met James Baker. They told exactly that. I don't think in 30 years the principles of NATO somehow changed dramatically. And again, all this talk about autocracy, democracy, can you name me just one dimension of democracy in which, for example, more democratic than Russia? Freedom of the speech, political pluralism, minority rights, racial equality. Just name one.
Well, it's very interesting you go down that route. Obviously, international observers would love to come and watch Russian elections in full, I'm sure. I want to go back to your idea that this is exercises. People have been monitoring troop movements from the Pacific coast. Why do you need to move troops from the Pacific coast for exercises? Why has leave been cancelled in Russia? Why do people track the trains that are bringing field hospitals and tanks into Belarus and other parts of the Ukrainian border? Why do you need 130,000, although I have to say the Ukrainians estimate now 147,000 troops to carry out exercises? Why is it necessary to carry out anything on this scale? And I go back to my first question, what is President Putin's intentions?
Well, first of all the figures you name are figures from the Western media, governments, and so on. I don't have this. And of course, they're definitely
you give me
false.
the figures then. You tell me the figures. What are the figures of those who are taking part in exercises?
We are not preparing. There is no military
Ukraine,
escalation
and
on the border.
around Crimea and in the Black Sea.
For the amount of forces which. May I speak? May I? Okay.
Yes, you may speak. Sorry, apologies. I thought I'd lost you. Carry on.
The amount of forces which are participating in the exercise in Belarus, 30,000. It's quite a standard military exercise. We're a huge country. Russia is not just a European country, it's a Euro-Pacific country. We have 11 time zones, and when we exercise in the east, we bring forces from the European part of Russia. When we exercise in the west, we bring forces from east. There is no intention in Russia to attack Ukraine. What President Putin wants, actually, we proposed two drafts. One, the draft of the security agreement with the United States. Another is the draft of security agreement with NATO. We've got the answers which do not address the security concerns of Russia. As for the military exercises, Russia can conduct it on its soil wherever and whenever it wants. It's no threat to anybody. We are actually concerned with NATO infrastructure approaching our border. NATO is the biggest military alliance on earth. It accounts for 75% of global military expenditures. Russia's military budget is 7% of that of NATO. And this huge military machine is approaching Russian border for 30 years against all our objections. And that's something that really worries us. Okay. So it's not about Ukraine choosing its alliance. It's about fighting alliance approaching our borders. And this alliance is not for defense. We know it was fighting in Afghanistan, it was fighting in Iraq, it was fighting in Syria, it was fighting in Libya, it was fighting in Yugoslavia after the end of the Cold War. And they killed millions of people. So for us, this is a challenge. As for the possibility,
I understand you're using those examples to show the Russian view that NATO is an offensive organization when you know full well it was set up as a defensive organization. Can I put it to you also one idea which is obviously mooted in the West, that actually President Putin is one of those people that will never get over the fall of the USSR and the loss of the 15 Soviet republics that went independent, and in fact doesn't really understand why Ukraine would want to be a democracy and an independent one at that, and actually sees Ukrainians as sort of confused Russians and Poles, and maybe, that they're not really a nation. It's not really a nation. And is that something that would occur to him? He's written, hasn't he, about, marry me and so on. So what does he fully accept that Ukraine is an independent democratic nation and that is fine by him?
Well, I do accept Ukraine as an independent nation for sure. Russia provided Ukraine independence as other 14 former Soviet republics. It was done by Russia. Mm-hmm. As for democracy, of course, this is questionable. I don't think Ukraine is a democracy. Otherwise, all the critics of the regime would not be in jail, dead, or in exile. And they would not close all the opposition TV channels, news media, and so on and so forth. I don't think Ukraine is a democracy. Ukraine is run by the United States of America. Until they left Kiev, there were 3,000 Americans with diplomatic passports in Kiev running the country. Becoming part of the alliance, this is the policy of those who run Ukraine. We didn't have problems with the previous governments of Ukraine, which were independent, really, from the Western domination. This government is not free to reflect the will of their own people. So I don't think Ukraine is a democracy. I think Russia actually is more democratic than Ukraine. We have some problems with democracy, but not as huge as in Ukraine. So this whole idea of the West presenting some principle of values is not really well received in Russia, because we know also a history of the Western values. Nationalism, chauvinism, fascism, Nazism, racial discrimination, global slave trade. No, this was not invented by Russians or the Chinese. These were all the Western values for centuries, actually. For us, the West is not the force of the good.
Nikonov, I do
We
apologise.
experienced in our history many centuries of attacks from the West. There were attacks of the Crusaders, there were attacks
Yeah, Vyacheslav, do you mind if I interrupt? I apologise for interrupting you.
Hitler, and now we have another wave of the Westerners coming to our borders with a huge military machine, which was not made.
Vyacheslav, Nikonov, I'm apologising. I have to interrupt you because the British Prime Minister has been speaking after a Cobra meeting. I apologise for cutting you off there. Fascinating to talk to you and hear the Russian viewpoint. First Deputy Chairman of the State Duma Committee on International Affairs. We much appreciate your time. Thank you.